Okay, let's go ahead and get into South Dakota. South Dakota knows how to party. South Dakota knows how to party. South Dakota. Citizens of South Dakota may initiate state statutes and constitutional amendments through direct means, meaning after a successful petition drive where initiatives qualify for the ballot can go straight to the ballot with no stop at the legislator. Citizens have the power to repeal legislation via referendum. The South Dakota state legislature will also place measures on the ballot as legislatively referred constitutional amendments or legislatively referred state statutes with a majority vote in each chamber. Single subject rule. In South Dakota, all citizen initiatives, both initiated constitutional amendments and initiated state statutes, must concern only one subject. So we've talked about that before. A lot of states have this rule. You can't have two different subjects as one ballot question. You can't do that. They see it as not fair. Subject restrictions in South Dakota, initiated measures and amendments may not create private or special laws. Also, they are not required to specify a funding source for mandated expenditures. 3 p.m., Eric. I see 2 p.m. in the chat. It's 3 p.m. tomorrow. Number required. In South Dakota, here are the signatures required. The following are the requirements for the types of citizen-initiated measures in South Dakota to get on the ballot. Initiated constitutional amendment, 10% of the votes cast for governor. For initiated state statute, 5% of votes cast for governor. And for veto referendum, 5% of votes cast for governor. Let's get to the first one. Theirs were actually pretty interesting. The first measure, South Dakota Constitutional Amendment C, 60% vote requirement for ballot measures increasing taxes or appropriating 10 million measure. A yes vote supported requiring 3/5, which is 60%, supermajority vote for the approval of ballot measures placed on the ballot through citizen initiative or referred to the ballot by the state legislature that increases taxes or fees or that will require the state to appropriate 10 million or more in the first 5 fiscal years. This measure failed by 67.43%. So this is what some states were trying to do. I told you guys, some states were trying to make it more difficult to pass certain measures in states by making that 60% requirement. So that failed. South Dakotans are smart. Let's go on here. It says, how would Amendment C impact other ballot measures in South Dakota? This was the big one. I did a story on this months ago. The higher threshold of votes required would have impacted future ballot measures, including the Medicaid expansion initiative, which was on the ballot in November. So that was one of the ones they were trying to stop. They didn't want, by they, I mean the government, they didn't want Medicaid expansion to pass in South Dakota. So they tried to make it more difficult by making it so that you have to have 60% of the votes say yes in order for it to pass, which means even if you have a majority, which is like 54, let's say 54%, even though the majorities would say yes, that would not pass because it wasn't 60%, right? So South Dakotans again are smart and they chose not to pass that rule, which is great. So that's great for them. No 60% requirement for those peeps. Who supported this? Republican representatives, Senator Schoenbeck, Goodwin, Hanson, or Representative Goodwin and Hanson. Organizations, Americans for Prosperity, South Dakota Farm Bureau, South Dakota Coalition for Responsible Taxation and Opportunity Solution Project. One of the arguments was we in the Republican Party, believe in keeping government under control, small and at the local level. We believe the best way to spend money is at the lowest level possible. Well, that did not pass. Who opposed it? The former U.S. Attorney of South Dakota, Brendan Johnson. and the Democratic Party of South Dakota, the South Dakota Farmers Union. That was interesting. And some of the organizations, American Heart Association and League of Women Voters, to name a few. And one of their arguments was it's unfair for 41% of the electorate to be able to thwart the other 59% on tax policy. Amendment C limits the citizens' ability to implement important public projects, even if the majority of voters want them funded. We're talking law enforcement, rural hospitals, nursing homes, schools. Just a few voters will be able to shut those all down. When you amplify the voice of the few, you silence the voice of many. That's very, very well put. Very well put. Campaign finance money. There was over $900,000 spent to support it, but there was over $1,800,000 to oppose it. And then the other measure that they had is the big one, the Medicaid expansion. This was the big one. South Dakota Constitutional Amendment Medicaid Expansion Initiative. A yes vote supported amending the state constitution to require the state to expand Medicaid to adults between 18 and 65 with incomes below 138% of the federal poverty level beginning July 1st, 2023. So that date has already passed. So they're already doing that. So yeah, that's important. The Medicaid expansion that passed by 56.24%. Now, if that measure would have passed about the 60% requirement, technically this would not have passed. See what they were trying to do? Was there another Medicaid expansion measure on the South Dakota ballot? Initiated Measure 28 was another Medicaid expansion measure. Initiated Measure 28 would have expanded Medicaid to adults between 18 and 65 with incomes below 133% of the federal poverty level. So that's the difference between the two. Who supported it? Democrats and 1, 2, 3, 4 Republicans. So some bipartisan support there. American Indian Tribes Union, South Dakota Education Association, organizations, AARP of South Dakota, American Heart Association, to name a few, right? So a lot of the medical organizations. One of the arguments, federal funding will pay 90% of expansion costs, with the state of South Dakota responsible for the remaining 10%. Expanding Medicaid means South Dakota will save more than $63 million in general funds in the first 2 years alone as a result of additional funding from the American Rescue Plan Act programs. Medicaid expansion would also return more than $1.3 billion tax dollars to South Dakotans from Washington, D.C. over a 5-year period. So interesting. South Dakota knows how to party. South Dakota. Who opposed it? All Republicans. Only Republicans opposed it. American for Prosperity, Americans for Tax Reform. And one of the arguments, we are being sold something like it's good for the economy. We are being sold this idea. It is good for the economy, good for creating jobs and so much more. Maybe it will create jobs for certain organizations, but it is not going to be good for our economy when the state is going to have to pay as much as it will for Medicaid expansion. But they already told you it actually saves the state money. So that argument is void. Next. There was over $4 million spent to support it and over $3,000 to oppose it. Remember, usually the more money you spend, the more likely it will go that way. And I believe there was a marijuana one. This is the last one. Now, this one, I didn't understand why this one didn't pass. It said no vote. South Dakota initiated Measure 27 marijuana legalization. A yes vote supported the ballot initiative to legalize the possession, distribution, and use of marijuana for persons who are at least 21 years old. It failed. No vote, 52.92%. Now, I don't need to go over, the regulations. You guys pretty much know how this works now by the states that have passed this, etc. They talk about the penalties. But this part is important. This measure also did not affect an employer's ability to restrict marijuana use by employees, limit an owner of private property to regulate or prohibit marijuana use on their property, limit the state or local government in prohibiting or regulating marijuana use on property owned by the state or the local government. So that part is important. This actually had bipartisan support, Democrats and Republicans. And there were two candidates, one Libertarian Party actually, and Democrat. Arguments: I would describe Measure 27 as cannabis legalization for the individual. It does not include licensing, regulations, taxation. It's really about personal freedom and ensuring that small amounts of cannabis do not make you a criminal. Isn't it interesting to you guys that still in this day and age, like people still make all this fuss about a plant? Well. It's interesting to me. And who opposed it? Republicans. There were some Republicans who opposed it, no Democrats that opposed it. One of the arguments was that expands the opportunity for black market, because if you saturate the economy with marijuana, it needs to go somewhere, because there are people aren't going to throw it away. They're going to start selling that to anybody that they can, to include our children and community, as if people don't already sell it now. Like some of the line of reasoning, like some of the arguments are just whack. Like, give me a break. Just wiggity whack. How much money was spent to support it? Over 180,000. How much was spent to oppose it? Over 500,000. And again, it usually goes towards the position where the most money was spent. And as you can see, it did not pass. Very interesting. South Dakota. One more note here from Roger, I almost forgot. This passed by almost 53%, which means with a little more engagement with voters on the ground, they can probably get this passed. However, this is something they should ratify as an amendment, since ratification for amendments only require 50% plus. Somehow I get the feeling South Dakota government would repeal or weaken it, especially since South Dakota doesn't limit how soon an initiative can be reattempted. Well said. Well said. I'll take the comment on Rockfin, Eric. Oh, or maybe not. Oh, here we go. Thank you for the tip on Rockfin, Roger. Sab, I just realized Amendment 1, 60% for new taxes. The legislator put this on the ballot in June because they knew Medicaid expansion would pass. Yep. So they needed a way to make sure not to fund it, making the measure inert. See how they try to sneak stuff past you, Sabby? They didn't even put it on the primary ballot, which was in April. Slick, real slick. Yep.